What if the shadows in your peripheral vision aren't tricks of light, but ancient beings watching from another dimension? It's a question that has haunted humanity since before recorded history, whispered in the margins of our consciousness, dismissed in the light of day, but impossible to shake in the darkness. That flicker you catch just beyond your field of view, that sense of being observed when you know you're alone, that inexplicable feeling that something intelligent lurks just beyond the veil of our visible world. What if these experiences aren't psychological glitches or evolutionary remnants, but authentic encounters with entities that have existed alongside us since the beginning of time? They are called the Djinn, beings of smokeless fire, created from the scorching desert winds, mentioned in the most ancient texts known to humanity. The Quran speaks of them with absolute certainty, not as metaphor or myth, but as fact. Created before Adam from the essential flame, a race of intelligent beings inhabiting a dimension that overlaps with ours, but remains forever just out of reach. Pre-Islamic texts scattered across Mesopotamia, Persia, and the Arabian Peninsula describe them with terrifying consistency. These were not the cartoon genies of modern imagination. These were something far older, far more dangerous, and disturbingly real. What makes the Djinn uniquely terrifying is this fundamental truth. Unlike ghosts, which are echoes of the dead, the Djinn are alive. They think, they plan, they remember. They have societies, hierarchies, conflicts, and most unsettling of all, they have agendas. They can choose to ignore you, help you, or destroy you. They are not bound by death because they were never human to begin with. They are the other intelligence on Earth, the parallel civilization that has watched empires rise and fall while remaining hidden in plain sight. Across the next chapters, we will journey through modern encounters that defy rational explanation. We will examine archaeological mysteries that suggest the Djinn were known to ancient civilizations in ways our history books have conveniently forgotten. We will trace the terrifying consistency of their descriptions across millennia and continents, from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of Central Asia, from medieval Europe to modern-day America. The testimonies remain the same, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, describing entities that should not exist but somehow do. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the emerging evidence that these beings may have shaped human civilization in profound ways. The sudden leaps in human knowledge, the mysterious origins of agriculture and writing, the uncanny similarities between myths across cultures that had no contact. What if the Djinn weren't just observers? What if they were architects, manipulating human development for purposes we cannot begin to fathom? The shadows are watching, and they always have been. In the spring of 2019, the Al-Rashid family stood in the courtyard of their ancestral home in the Al-Malaz district of Riyadh, watching workers tear down walls that had stood for generations. The house had been in the family for over a century, passed down through bloodlines that traced back to the earliest days of Saudi Arabia's capital city. Now, with inheritance money and modern ambitions, they planned to transform the aging structure into something magnificent, something worthy of their heritage. The patriarch, Abdullah al-Rashid, a successful businessman in his 50s, envisioned marble floors where cracked tiles lay, modern fixtures where rusted pipes snaked through walls. His wife, Noura, supported the renovation enthusiastically, dreaming of hosting family gatherings in spaces both historic and contemporary. Their 3 children, ranging from 14 to 22 years old, looked forward to claiming bedrooms in the expanded second floor. None of them could have imagined that within 6 months, they would flee this house in terror, leaving behind not just their renovations, but nearly everything they owned. The first indication that something had shifted in the house came 3 weeks after construction began. Workers had breached a wall in the oldest section of the home, a corner room that had served as storage for decades. Behind the plaster and stone, they discovered a small sealed chamber, barely large enough for a person to stand in. Inside, there was nothing but dust and darkness, yet the foreman later told Abdullah that none of his men wanted to work in that area anymore. They complained of headaches, of feeling watched, of an oppressive heaviness that settled on their chests when they entered that part of the house. Abdullah dismissed it as superstition, the kind of foolish talk that holds progress hostage. He offered bonus pay, and the work continued. Noura was the first family member to hear the whispers. It was late evening, after the workers had left, when she walked through the house, inspecting the day's progress. She described it later as a voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves, speaking in a classical Arabic so formal and archaic that she could barely understand it. The cadence was wrong. The pronunciation belonged to centuries past. She caught only fragments, words that seemed to be warnings, or perhaps claims of ownership. When she stopped to listen more carefully, the whispers ceased. When she moved on, they resumed, always at the edge of her hearing, always just unclear enough to create doubt. She mentioned it to Abdullah that night, and he attributed it to the echo of wind through the construction gaps, the house settling, the acoustic peculiarities of partially demolished walls. But the whispers continued, and soon other family members heard them too. Their youngest son, Faisal, began refusing to sleep in his room, claiming that someone was talking to him in the darkness, using words he didn't understand but that filled him with inexplicable dread. Their daughter Layla reported the same phenomenon while studying in the evening, a low murmuring in classical Arabic that seemed to circle around her. The eldest son, Muhammad, skeptical by nature and studying engineering at King Saud University, set up his phone to record overnight. The next morning, the playback revealed something that chilled him despite his rational mindset. For hours, there was nothing but silence. Then, at 3:47 in the morning, a voice emerged, clear and articulate, speaking in classical Arabic, reciting what sounded like poetry from the Abbasid period, verses about land and belonging and the insult of intrusion. Abdullah, confronted with the recording, finally acknowledged that something unusual was occurring. He reached out to the local imam at their mosque, Sheikh Hassan al-Dosari, a man known for his knowledge of ruqyah, the Islamic practice of exorcism used to combat jinn possession and supernatural. Sheikh Hassan agreed to visit the house to assess the situation with both religious knowledge and practical experience. He had performed ruqyah many times over his 30 years of religious service, helping families troubled by what Islam recognizes as the invisible world of jinn, beings created from smokeless fire who share our world but exist beyond our normal perception. When Sheikh Hassan entered the Al-Rashid home in late June of 2019, he later described feeling an immediate and powerful presence. The air itself seemed thick with hostility, with an intelligence that watched and assessed him. He began with prayers of protection, reciting verses from the Quran known for their power to repel evil entities. As he moved through the house, his recitations echoing off the partially finished walls, the atmosphere grew heavier. In the corner room where the sealed chamber had been discovered, Sheikh Hassan reported experiencing something he had rarely encountered in decades of practice. The presence revealed itself, not through possession of a family member, but through direct communication, a voice that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, speaking that same classical Arabic that had whispered to the family. The entity, according to Sheikh Hassan's detailed account, claimed to have dwelt in that location for 800 years. It spoke of a time when the land was desert, when Riyadh was merely a collection of mud brick structures, when the Al-Rashid family's ancestors had not yet been born. It described watching human settlements rise and fall, watching families come and go, tolerating their presence as long as they respected the invisible boundaries. But this renovation, this tearing down of walls and exposure of hidden spaces, this constituted a violation. The sealed chamber had been a boundary, a compromise between worlds. By breaching it, the family had broken an ancient agreement they never knew existed. Sheikh Hassan performed the first full ruqyah that evening, a ritual involving extensive Quran recitation, blessed water, and prayers of expulsion. The house responded violently. Doors slammed throughout the structure despite no wind, no drafts. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness broken only by the imam's phone flashlight. The temperature dropped precipitously, their breath visible in the summer heat. Most disturbing, objects began to move. Small items at first, tools left by workers sliding across floors, then larger pieces, furniture shifting, a wooden chair lifting and hurling itself across a room. The family gathered in the main hall, terrified but determined as Sheikh Hassan continued his recitations, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. When dawn broke and the activity subsided, Sheikh Hassan advised the family that this was no ordinary jinn disturbance. The entity was powerful, ancient, and deeply rooted in that location. He recommended they cease the renovation immediately. and consider whether remaining in the house was worth the spiritual battle ahead. Abdullah, proud and stubborn, refused to be driven from his family home by what he still hoped might be explained or overcome. Sheikh Hassan agreed to return, to perform additional ruqyah sessions, but his expression carried a warning that Abdullah chose not to fully comprehend. The physical attacks began in July. Noor woke one morning with burns on her arms, 3 parallel marks that looked like fingers had pressed into her skin with intense heat. She had felt nothing during the night, discovered them only when dressing. The burns were severe enough to require medical attention, yet doctors found no explanation. The marks were consistent with contact burns, but there was no source of heat in her bedroom, no rational explanation for injuries sustained while sleeping. Within days, other family members displayed similar marks. Faisal had burns across his back. Layla woke screaming. Her shoulder burned in a pattern that looked disturbingly like a handprint. The electronic malfunctions escalated into patterns too specific to dismiss as coincidence. Every day at precisely 3:47 in the afternoon, and again at 3:47 in the morning, every electronic device in the house would malfunction simultaneously. Phones would display screens of static, televisions would turn on by themselves showing only white noise. Computers would crash, lights would strobe. This happened with such regularity that the family began to dread those moments, gathering together as the time approached, watching their devices descend into chaos exactly on schedule. They brought in electricians who found nothing wrong with the wiring, no explanation for the synchronized failures. The audio recordings that the family captured during this period remain some of the most disturbing evidence of their ordeal. Mohammed, determined to document what was happening, set up multiple recording devices throughout the house. The resulting audio files captured hours of activity. There were the whispers in classical Arabic, now identifiable as threats and declarations of territory. There were sounds of movement, of heavy footsteps in empty rooms, of objects being dragged across floors when no one was present. Most chilling were the recordings from the sealed chamber room, where a voice could be heard reciting what researchers later identified as poetry from the 13th century, verses about guardianship and eternal watching, about the folly of mortals who build and believe they own the earth. Sheikh Hassan returned multiple times throughout July and August, each ruqyah session more intense than the last. He brought other religious scholars, men experienced in dealing with difficult jinn cases. They performed collective ruqyah, their combined voices filling the house with chronic verses of protection and expulsion. The entity fought back each time. During one session, Sheikh Hassan himself was struck by an invisible force, knocked backward with such violence that he hit the wall and sustained bruised ribs. Objects flew through the air during the recitations. The whispers became shouts, the classical Arabic now clearly audible to everyone present, a voice of terrible age and anger demanding they leave, that they restore what was sealed, that they abandon this place that was never truly theirs. In one particularly harrowing confrontation, the entity spoke directly through the electrical system, the voice emerging from speakers, from phones, from any device capable of producing sound. It declared in that ancient dialect that this land had been walked by Djinn before humans claimed it, that agreements older than any human law governed this space, that the Al-Rashid family were trespassers in a conflict they could not comprehend. Sheikh Hassan responded with verses from Surah Al-Jinn, reminding the entity that all beings, whether human or jinn, are subject to the will of Allah, that no creature has ultimate claim to any space, that the family had the right to live in their home in peace. But peace was not to be found. The attacks intensified. Family members reported being pushed downstairs by invisible hands, being held down in their beds at night, unable to move or scream, experiencing vivid nightmares of ancient deserts and watching eyes. The burns became more frequent and more severe. Abdullah himself, the skeptic who had dismissed the early signs, woke one night to find himself unable to breathe, an invisible pressure on his chest, that archaic voice whispering directly in his ear that his bloodline meant nothing, that 800 years of residence trumped a mere century of human occupation. By late August of 2019, the Al-Rashid family reached their breaking point. After a night of particularly violent activity, after their youngest son was found unconscious with burn marks covering his arms and face, they made the decision that would define the rest of their lives. They would leave. not temporarily, not until things calmed down, but permanently. They packed what possessions they could in a single frantic day, taking only essentials, leaving behind furniture, family heirlooms, the investments they had made in renovation. Sheikh Hassan performed a final prayer over the family, a blessing of protection, and advised them that they were making the right choice. Some battles, he told them, are not meant to be fought. Some claims predate our own. Some entities have earned their territory through centuries of occupation that our brief human lifespans cannot challenge. The house in Al-Malaz district stands empty to this day. The Al-Rashid family never returned, not even to retrieve belongings they left behind. They sold the property at a devastating loss to a buyer who was not told the full history. But that buyer never moved in either. Reports from neighbors suggest that the whispers can still be heard by those who pass close to the walls, that the classical Arabic murmurings continue their eternal declarations of ownership. The sealed chamber remains open, a dark mouth in the corner room, where something ancient first made its displeasure known. Sheikh Hassan, now retired from active ministry, still speaks about the Al-Rashid case as one of the most powerful Djinn manifestations he encountered in his career. He maintains that the entity's claim of 800 years of residence was likely true, that some Djinn do indeed establish territories and maintain them across centuries that see human civilizations rise and fall around them. The physical evidence, the burns that scarred family members, the audio recordings that captured impossible voices, the electronic patterns that defied explanation, all point to an encounter with something genuinely outside normal experience. The story of the Al-Rashid family serves as a reminder that beneath our modern cities, beneath the concrete and the construction, there may be older claims, older residents, older agreements that we break at our peril. Their ancestral home, meant to be a bridge between heritage and future, became instead a battleground between human ambition and something far more ancient. And in that battle, the age-old presence proved immovable, while the family, for all their history and rights, became refugees from their own inheritance. In the parched hills surrounding Jerusalem, beneath layers of dust and devotion, lie fragments of a mystery that has haunted 3 great religions for millennia. The story begins not with prayers or prophets, but with something far more troubling: a king who commanded demons, bound spirits to his will, and wielded a power so absolute that its echoes still resonate in amulet shops, from Marrakech to Sana'a. Solomon, son of David, ruled over ancient Israel during the 10th century before the Common Era. History remembers him as a builder, a sage, a poet who authored songs that still stir the soul. But buried within the Talmud, inscribed in grimoires banned by medieval churches, and whispered in the oral traditions of Jewish mystics, lies another legacy entirely: Solomon the sorcerer, Solomon the binder of Djinn. Solomon, who possessed a seal of such formidable power that it granted him dominion over every spirit, demon, and supernatural entity that walked between the worlds. The Testament of Solomon, a Greek text composed sometime between the 1st and 5th centuries of the Common Era, preserves the most complete account of these disturbing practices. The manuscript, long dismissed by mainstream scholars as apocryphal fantasy, describes in unsettling detail how the king enslaved legions of demons to construct the first temple in Jerusalem. According to the text, Solomon did not hire craftsmen or laborers for his great architectural achievement. Instead, he commanded an army of bound Djinn, each compelled by the power of his ring to hew stone, forge bronze, and raise pillars that no human hands could lift. The Testament records the names of these entities, their specialties, and the specific incantations required to subjugate them. Ornias, a demon who strangled young men and transformed into a beautiful woman to seduce them, was among the first bound. The text describes how Solomon's most trusted servant complained that this entity was draining his life force. In response, the king gave the servant his ring, instructed him in its use, and commanded him to strike the demon across the face with it. The moment the seal touched Ornias, the creature became utterly obedient, compelled by forces it could not resist to serve the king's purposes. What makes this account particularly chilling is its clinical precision. These are not vague references to spiritual authority or divine favor. The Testament reads like an instruction manual, detailing techniques, tools, and methods. Solomon interrogates each captured demon about its nature, its vulnerabilities, and which angel has power over it. He builds a comprehensive taxonomy of the invisible world, cataloging its inhabitants with the same methodical attention he might give to organizing a royal treasury. Archaeological excavations across the Temple Mount have yielded tantalizing hints that something unusual transpired at this site. In 1999, during unauthorized construction work by the Islamic Waqf, tons of archaeologically rich soil were dumped in the Kidron Valley. Subsequent sifting operations, conducted by the Temple Mount Sifting Project, recovered thousands of artifacts spanning multiple periods of occupation. Among these finds were amulets, seal impressions, and inscribed fragments bearing symbols associated with protective magic and spirit binding. Dr. Gabriel Barquet, who co-founded the Sifting Project, noted the prevalence of what he termed apotropaic devices, objects designed to ward off or control supernatural forces. While careful to maintain academic neutrality, he acknowledged that the concentration of such items in Temple Mount soil suggests that magical practices were not peripheral to ancient Judaic religion, but potentially central to it. The line between priest and magician, he observed, may have been far thinner than later religious authorities would prefer to admit. The Seal of Solomon itself, described in various texts as a pentagram, hexagram, or more complex geometric pattern, appears with striking frequency across the ancient Middle East and North Africa. Excavations at sites in Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq have uncovered talismans bearing six-pointed stars and interlocking triangles accompanied by inscriptions invoking Solomon's authority over spirits. These are not isolated curiosities, but part of a widespread magical tradition that spanned cultures and centuries. In 1936, French archaeologists working at Dura Europos in eastern Syria discovered a remarkably preserved 3rd-century synagogue covered in elaborate frescoes. Among the images adorning its walls were scenes from Solomon's life, including depictions that scholars believe reference his command over supernatural forces. The images show the king in positions of authority, surrounded by figures that do not appear entirely human, their proportions subtly wrong, their gestures suggesting submission rather than worship. The question that troubles researchers is whether these widespread traditions preserve actual knowledge about interacting with non-human intelligences, or whether they represent something else entirely: psychological projections, cultural metaphors, or the universal human tendency to imagine hidden powers behind visible events. Professor Yuval Harari, a historian at Tel Aviv University specializing in medieval Jewish magic, argues that the Solomon legends cannot be dismissed as mere superstition. In his analysis of medieval grimoires, he notes that the techniques attributed to the king show remarkable consistency across geographically and temporally distant sources. The methods for binding spirits, the ritual preparations required, the specific names and seals employed, all of these elements appear again and again in texts from Spain to Persia, from the early medieval period through the Renaissance and beyond. This consistency suggests either a common source of extraordinary antiquity, or, more disturbingly, that these methods were tested, refined, and transmitted because they produced results that practitioners found meaningful. Whether those results were genuine contact with supernatural entities or powerful psychological experiences induced by ritual practice remains a matter of fierce debate. The disturbing aspects of the Solomon narrative become more pronounced when we examine the moral framework, or lack thereof, presented in the texts. The king does not appeal to these entities or negotiate with them. He does not seek to understand or placate them. He captures them, interrogates them, and forces them into labor. The relationship is one of absolute domination, spirit slavery on a massive scale. The Testament describes demons begging for mercy, pleading to be released from the seal's compulsion, and Solomon showing no compassion whatsoever. His goal is utilitarian: build the temple, and any being that can contribute to that goal will be pressed into service. This raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of sacred architecture. If we take the legends at face value, then one of the holiest sites in human history was constructed through coercion and supernatural bondage. The stones themselves would carry the anguish of enslaved entities, and the divine presence that later filled the temple would dwell in a structure built by captive demons. The cognitive dissonance is profound. In modern Morocco, Yemen, and parts of North Africa, The Seal of Solomon remains a vital component of protective magic. Silver pendants bearing the six-pointed star are sold in souks alongside herbs and incense. Local practitioners, often women who inherit knowledge through matrilineal lines, inscribe the seal on doorposts, incorporate it into healing rituals, and invoke Solomon's name when dealing with cases of spirit possession or curse removal. These are not historical reenactments or symbolic gestures. The people who use these methods believe, with the certainty born of experience, that the seal retains its power to command and constrain Djinn. In 2011, anthropologist Dr. Amira El-Zain conducted extensive fieldwork in southern Morocco, documenting contemporary practices involving Djinn and the protective measures people employ against them. She found that Solomon is regarded not as a distant historical figure, but as an active presence whose techniques remain effective. One elderly woman she interviewed, a healer respected throughout her village, described using the seal exactly as the ancient texts prescribe, inscribing it on parchment with specific inks, reciting the proper names, and compelling Djinn to cease their harassment of her clients. When Dr. El-Zain asked whether the woman believed Solomon had actually controlled demons, her response was unequivocal. Of course he did. The knowledge was given to him for a purpose, and those who learn the proper methods can access that same authority. The healer's confidence was not based on faith alone, but on decades of practice, outcomes she had witnessed, afflictions resolved, and malevolent presences banished. This presents a challenge to the modern skeptical mindset. We can easily dismiss ancient texts as mythology, but how do we account for living traditions that claim continuous efficacy? Is this mass delusion perpetuated across generations, or does the Solomon magical system tap into something real? Perhaps not literal demons, but psychological or social mechanisms that respond predictably to ritual intervention? Some researchers have proposed that the Djinn of ancient accounts may represent attempts to describe psychological phenomena that pre-scientific cultures lacked other frameworks to explain. Intrusive thoughts, compulsive behaviors, dissociative states, all of these could be interpreted as external entities influencing the individual. By externalizing these experiences and subjecting them to ritual control, practitioners might achieve genuine therapeutic effects, not through commanding literal spirits, but through engaging the unconscious mind in its own symbolic language. Others argue that this explanation is too convenient, a way of preserving materialist assumptions while acknowledging that something significant is occurring. They point to accounts from multiple cultures describing entities with consistent characteristics, behaviors, and vulnerabilities. If these were purely psychological projections, why would unrelated societies develop such similar descriptions? Why would the methods for dealing with them show such remarkable overlap? The archaeological evidence, while suggestive, cannot provide definitive answers. We have symbols, we have texts, we have artifacts clearly designed for magical purposes. What we lack is the experiential knowledge that would allow us to understand how these items were actually used, and what effects, if any, they produced. The techniques are preserved, but the context, the lived reality of ancient magical practice, remains tantalizingly out of reach. Perhaps the most profound question is not whether Solomon actually commanded Djinn, but what it means that this story has persisted with such tenacity across millennia. Why does this particular narrative resonate so deeply? What does it reveal about human aspirations and fears? The desire for control over chaos, for authority over invisible forces that seem to influence our lives, for knowledge that transcends ordinary understanding. These are perennial human longings. Solomon in this reading becomes an archetype of the magician king, the human who pierced the veil and grasped powers that others could only imagine. Yet, there remains the unsettling possibility that the ancients preserved these accounts because they were describing, however imperfectly, genuine interactions with non-human intelligences. That somewhere in the vast spectrum of reality, there exist entities responsive to certain symbols, names, and rituals. That Solomon, whether through revelation, experimentation, or inheritance of older knowledge, discovered functional methods for engaging with these entities, and that this knowledge, now fragmented and half-forgotten, still works for those who approach it with the proper understanding. The question hangs in the air like incense smoke in a sealed chamber. What did ancient peoples know about these entities that we have forgotten? And perhaps more troubling still, if we remembered, Would we want to use that knowledge, or would we recoil from it in horror, recognizing too late that some doors once opened can never truly be closed again? In the Islamic tradition, every human being is said to be born with a constant companion, invisible yet intimate, a Djinn known as the Qareen. Unlike the Djinn of folklore who might be summoned or bound by sorcerers, the Qareen is different. It is assigned to you at birth, tethered to your soul, whispering suggestions toward evil with every breath you take. The Prophet Muhammad himself spoke of this entity, describing how even he possessed a Qareen, though his had been rendered powerless through divine intervention. For the rest of humanity, this spiritual shadow remains active, a personal demon who knows you better than you know yourself, who has witnessed every moment of your life from your first cry to your last breath. Amina Hassan believed she had finally met hers in the winter of 2021. The young woman from Dearborn, Michigan had always considered herself a moderate Muslim, observant but not obsessive, connected to her faith, but living comfortably in the modern world. She worked as a medical billing specialist, lived alone in a modest apartment near Warren Avenue, and maintained close relationships with her family, who lived just a few blocks away. By all accounts, she was ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of person whose life would never warrant the attention she would eventually receive. The changes began subtly, as these things often do. Amina started experiencing gaps in her memory, moments where hours would simply vanish. She would find herself in rooms with no recollection of entering them, discover notes written in her own handwriting containing thoughts she did not remember thinking. Her sister Yasmin later recalled noticing the shift in November of that year, how Amina seemed distracted during family dinners, how she would pause mid-sentence, as if listening to someone no one else could hear. By December, Amina sought help. Her primary care physician referred her to Dr. Elizabeth Moreau, a psychiatrist affiliated with Beaumont Hospital. Dr. Moreau spent several sessions with Amina, documenting symptoms that aligned closely with dissociative identity disorder. Amina described hearing a voice, distinct from her own thoughts, that seemed to originate from somewhere inside her consciousness, yet remained utterly foreign. This voice knew things about her life that she had never shared with anyone, intimate details of childhood experiences, secret fears she had never vocalized, moments of shame she had worked hard to forget. What disturbed Dr. Moreau most was the consistency and specificity of Amina's accounts. Patients with dissociative disorders often display fragmented or contradictory narratives, memories that shift and change with each telling. Amina's descriptions remained unwavering. The voice had a personality, a sense of humor dark and mocking, and it claimed to have been with her always, watching, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. Dr. Moreau began recording their sessions in January of 2021, a standard practice for complex psychological cases. It was during the fourth recorded session that something happened which would later become the subject of intense debate among both mental health professionals and Islamic scholars. Amina had been describing an incident from her childhood, a moment when she was 7 years old and had stolen money from her mother's purse to buy candy. She had never been caught, never confessed, and had convinced herself over the years that perhaps it had never really happened, that maybe it was just a dream or a false memory. As she spoke about this buried guilt, her voice began to change. The transformation was not subtle. The pitch dropped, the cadence shifted, and suddenly the words coming from Amina's mouth were no longer hers. The entity that spoke identified itself as her Qareen. It laughed at the memory of the stolen money, claiming credit for planting the desire in young Amina's mind. But then it went further, describing other moments from her childhood that Amina herself could not consciously recall. It spoke of a day when she was 4 years old, hiding in a closet during a violent argument between her parents, covering her ears and singing to herself to block out the shouting. It described the pattern of the dress she had been wearing, yellow with small blue flowers, and the smell of mothballs from the winter coats surrounding her. Dr. Moreau stopped the session immediately, deeply unsettled. When Amina returned to her normal state of consciousness, she had no memory of what had transpired, no recollection of the voice speaking through her. The psychiatrist reached out to Amina's mother, carefully inquiring about the childhood incident without revealing the source of her information. Amina's mother confirmed every detail, There had been such an argument. Amina had been wearing that specific dress, and they had found her hours later asleep in the closet, though young Amina had never spoken about what she had witnessed. This was not information that could be easily dismissed as fabrication or false memory. Amina, in her conscious state, had no recollection of this traumatic event. The repression was genuine, a protective mechanism her young mind had employed to shield itself from pain. Yet the voice, the entity claiming to be her Qareen, possessed complete access to this buried memory. Dr. Moreau consulted with colleagues, sharing the recordings under conditions of strict confidentiality. The responses varied wildly. Some suggested elaborate theories involving cryptomnesia, the phenomenon where forgotten memories resurface without recognition of their origin. Others proposed that Amina was an exceptionally skilled manipulator, somehow deceiving everyone around her, though the motivation for such deception remained unclear. A few, uncomfortable with the implications, simply refused to offer opinions. The case came to the attention of Sheikh Omar al-Hassani, a respected Islamic scholar and imam at the Dearborn Mosque, through a member of Amina's extended family seeking religious guidance. Sheikh al-Hassani agreed to meet with both Amina and Dr. Moreau, a collaboration that represented an unusual intersection of faith and modern psychiatry. Sheikh al-Hassani approached the case with both theological knowledge and careful skepticism. He explained that in Islamic tradition, the Qareen is understood as a real entity, not merely a metaphor for evil inclination. Every person has one, a Djinn made from smokeless fire, assigned by divine decree to test faith and character. However, he emphasized that the Qareen typically operates through subtle whispers, gentle suggestions toward wrongdoing, not through overt possession or control of speech. What Amina was experiencing, if genuinely spiritual in nature, represented something far more severe, a breakdown in the barrier that normally keeps the Qareen separate from human consciousness. Sheikh al-Hassani noted that such cases, while rare, appear in Islamic history and jurisprudence. They often occur during periods of spiritual vulnerability, when regular prayer and remembrance of God have been neglected, creating openings for darker influences to gain strength. Together, Dr. Moreau and Sheikh al-Hassani conducted several sessions with Amina present. These meetings were tense, uncomfortable affairs where medical observation met religious ritual. Sheikh al-Hassani would recite verses from the Quran, specific passages believed to offer protection against Djinn, while Dr. Moreau monitored Amina's physiological responses and behavioral changes. During one particularly disturbing session in February of 2021, the entity spoke again. This time, it addressed Sheikh al-Hassani directly, demonstrating knowledge of classical Arabic that Amina, who spoke only basic conversational Arabic, should not have possessed. It quoted hadith, the recorded sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, but twisted their meanings, offering interpretations designed to promote despair rather than hope, fear rather than faith. The voice mocked the attempts to silence it, claiming that it had every right to speak, that it had been assigned to Amina just as breath had been assigned to her lungs. It described its role not as punishment but as test, a divinely sanctioned trial that every human must face. The challenge, it suggested, was whether Amina would recognize its whispers for what they were and resist, or whether she would mistake its voice for her own thoughts and surrender to its guidance. What made the recordings particularly unsettling was the quality of the voice itself. Audio analysis showed distinct differences in pitch, resonance, and speech patterns between Amina's normal voice and the entity's voice. While skeptics argued this could be explained by conscious or unconscious vocal manipulation, the consistency and stability of these differences across multiple sessions suggested something more complex than simple theatrical performance. Dr. Moreau found herself in an increasingly uncomfortable position professionally. The medical model demanded a diagnosis rooted in psychology, yet the evidence before her resisted easy categorization. Dissociative identity disorder typically emerges from severe trauma, with alternate identities serving protective functions. The entity in Amina's case showed no protective qualities whatsoever. It seemed designed purely to torment, to reveal painful truths, and to undermine Amina's sense of self. Sheikh al-Hassani, meanwhile, grew increasingly convinced of the spiritual nature of the case. He recommended an intensive program of religious treatment, including constant recitation of protective prayers, avoidance of isolation, and maintaining ritual purity. He also suggested that Amina's situation might have been exacerbated by her relatively lax religious practice prior to the onset of symptoms, though he was careful to frame this as observation rather than blame. The debate between psychological and spiritual interpretations reached beyond Amina's individual case, touching on fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and the boundaries of human personality. Where does mental illness end and spiritual crisis begin? Can both exist simultaneously, overlapping and reinforcing each other? Western psychiatry, rooted in materialist assumptions, struggles to accommodate phenomena that resist neurological or psychological explanation. Yet millions of people worldwide live within religious frameworks that take spiritual entities as seriously as physical bodies. By March of 2021, Amina made the decision to withdraw from conventional psychiatric treatment and place herself under the full-time spiritual care of Sheikh Al-Hassani and the religious community at the Dearborn Mosque. Dr. Moreau, while concerned about this choice, respected Amina's autonomy and maintained limited contact to monitor her well-being from a distance. The program Sheikh Al-Hassani implemented was rigorous and demanding. Amina moved back in with her parents, giving up her independent apartment. She was never to be alone, especially after sunset. Family members took turns maintaining constant presence with her, praying alongside her during the 5 daily prayers and throughout the night. She began wearing hijab strictly, covering completely in the traditional manner. Her room was kept illuminated at all times, the darkness viewed as an environment where the Qareen's influence grew stronger. She stopped working, her days consumed entirely by religious observance and recovery. The voice, according to family members, became less frequent but did not disappear entirely. It would emerge during moments of stress or fatigue, usually late at night, mocking her efforts at piety and reminding her of past mistakes and secret shames. Amina learned to recognize the onset of these episodes, to call for family members to pray with her, to recite specific verses that seemed to push back against the entity's presence. Years have passed since those initial terrifying months. Amina Hassan continues to live with her parents in Dearborn, now in her early 30s. Her life dramatically restricted compared to the independence she once enjoyed. She maintains constant prayer, observes all religious obligations with meticulous care, and refuses to be alone in darkness. Those close to her report that she seems at peace with her situation, having accepted this as her test, her personal jihad against an enemy no one else can see. Dr. Moreau, when asked about the case in professional contexts, describes it as one of the most challenging she has encountered. She remains uncertain about the ultimate nature of what afflicted Amina, acknowledging that psychiatric frameworks may be insufficient to fully explain the phenomena she witnessed. The recordings remain in secure storage, occasionally reviewed by researchers seeking to understand the intersection of faith, culture, and mental health. Sheikh Al-Hassani speaks of Amina as a cautionary tale, but also as a testimony to the unseen realities that exist alongside our material world. He uses her story, with her permission, to educate younger community members about the importance of consistent religious practice, not out of fear, but as protection against influences that seek to lead humans astray. The question of what truly happened to Amina Hassan remains unresolved. Was this dissociative identity disorder triggered by repressed trauma, manifesting through the cultural lens of Islamic belief? Or was it genuine spiritual affliction, the Qareen breaking through barriers that normally contain it, revealing itself in ways that Islamic tradition acknowledges as possible but rare? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere between these poles, in a space where psychology and spirituality overlap in ways that neither discipline alone can fully address. What remains undeniable is the transformation of one woman's life, the way an internal voice, whether spawned from fractured psychology or supernatural origin, reshaped her reality completely. Amina Hassan lives now in a state of perpetual spiritual warfare, fighting an enemy that knows her intimately, that has been with her since birth, that whispers still in the quiet moments, reminding her that it will be there until her final breath. The shadow self that every human carries, seen or unseen, acknowledged or denied. The last transmission from the 2017 Ubar expedition came through at 3:47 in the morning on the 19th of November. The voice of Dr. Sarah Chen, lead archaeologist from the University of Dubai, was barely recognizable through the static. Her words, fragmented and desperate, spoke of something moving between the tents, something that should not exist. Then silence. Just the empty hiss of dead air across 400 miles of sand. The expedition had begun 4 months earlier with the kind of enthusiasm that often precedes disaster. Dr. Chen had spent 7 years analyzing satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar data, and medieval Arabic texts that referenced Ubar, the fabled Atlantis of the sands. The city that Allah himself supposedly destroyed, burying it beneath the dunes as punishment for its people's worship of Djinn rather than the divine. Most scholars dismissed Ubar as pure mythology, a cautionary tale spun by desert storytellers. But Chen had found something in the data that convinced her otherwise. Anomalies in the sand, geometric patterns visible only from space, the suggestion of massive structures lurking beneath centuries of accumulated desert. She assembled a team of 12 archaeologists, geologists, a documentary filmmaker named Marcus Webb, and 3 local Bedouin guides from the Beit Kathir tribe. The guides, Hassan al-Rashidi and his 2 nephews, agreed to lead them into the empty quarter with visible reluctance. Hassan, a man in his 60s whose family had navigated these sands for generations, made his position clear from the first meeting. There are places in the Rub al Khali that should remain untouched, he told Chen. Places where the old things sleep, where the boundary between worlds grows thin. Chen dismissed his warnings as superstition. She had spent her career applying scientific methodology to archaeological puzzles. She did not believe in Djinn or curses or the supernatural. She believed in evidence in the patient work of uncovering human history. That certainty would not survive the empty quarter. The expedition reached the coordinates in late September. The site looked like nothing at first. Just more endless sand, the same barren landscape that stretched in every direction. But as they began excavating, following the anomalies Chen had identified, they found the first stones. Massive blocks of limestone, carved with inscriptions that predated Islam by centuries. The script was ancient South Arabian, the language of the frankincense kingdoms that once thrived on the peninsula's edges. As they dug deeper, the scale of what they had found became apparent. This was not a small settlement. It was a city, buried so completely that even its memory had faded into legend. The first week proceeded normally. The team worked from dawn until the heat became unbearable, then resumed in the evening when temperatures dropped. They uncovered streets, the foundations of buildings, and a central plaza dominated by a massive stone structure that Chen initially thought might be a temple. The architecture was unlike anything in the archaeological record. The stones fit together with impossible precision, no mortar between them, yet standing firm despite millennia buried in shifting sand. The inscriptions they translated spoke of prosperity, of caravans bringing wealth from distant lands, of a city that commanded the frankincense trade routes. But there were other inscriptions too. Warnings carved in frantic, uneven letters. Pleas for forgiveness. References to pacts that should never have been made, and gates that should never have been opened. Hassan refused to enter the excavation site after the 3rd day. He set up his tent half a mile away and would come no closer. When Webb, the filmmaker, asked him why, Hassan pointed to the ruins and said simply that the sand had covered this place for a reason. That burial was mercy, not punishment. His nephews stayed with the expedition, but their unease was obvious. They worked quickly, never lingering after sunset, and they prayed more frequently than they had at the journey's beginning. The shared nightmares started on the 10th day. Dr. Chen mentioned it casually at breakfast. She had dreamed of walking through streets filled with people, a thriving city under a sky that seemed wrong somehow, the stars arranged in patterns she did not recognize. 2 other team members looked up sharply. They had experienced the same dream, the same impossible city, the same wrong sky. By that evening, 9 of the 12 team members reported identical dreams. They compared details and found the similarities too precise to dismiss as coincidence. They all walked the same streets, saw the same faces, heard the same language, a flowing melodic speech none of them understood while awake, but which seemed perfectly comprehensible in sleep. The geologist, Dr. Rahman, attempted to rationalize it. Perhaps they were unconsciously processing what they saw during excavation, their minds constructing a shared narrative based on the ruins. But that explanation faltered when team members began describing buildings they had not yet uncovered, describing them with such accuracy that when they excavated those areas the following day, they found exactly what the dreams had shown them. The time distortions were harder to explain away. Team members would look at their watches and find hours had passed in what felt like minutes, or the reverse. Sarah Chen documented one incident where she entered the central temple structure at what her watch showed as 2 in the afternoon. She explored for what she estimated as perhaps 20 minutes. When she emerged, her watch showed 2:17, but the sun's position indicated late afternoon, nearly 4 hours later. Every other watch and clock in the camp confirmed this. 4 hours of her life, simply gone, with no memory of where they went. The expedition footage, later reviewed by dozens of experts, shows phenomena that resist rational explanation. On the 14th day, Webb filmed the team surveying the temple interior. In the video, every compass begins spinning wildly, needles rotating with no pattern, pointing everywhere and nowhere. The team tries different compasses, thinking the devices are faulty. All of them malfunction identically. When they step back outside the temple walls, the compasses immediately return to normal, all needles pointing true north as if nothing had happened. 3 days later, every electronic device in camp died simultaneously. Cameras, laptops, satellite phones, GPS units, everything went dark at precisely 8:31 in the evening. The team had backup batteries, solar chargers, redundant systems. Nothing worked. They sat in the darkness, lit only by chemical glow sticks and a single gas lantern, and listened to sounds moving through the ruins. Footsteps on stone, whispers in that same melodic language from their dreams. When sunrise came and they checked their equipment, everything functioned perfectly again. No one could identify what had caused this simultaneous failure, but it was the figures that broke them. Team members began reporting sightings of people in the desert, distant silhouettes standing on dunes, watching the camp. The shapes appeared in the peripheral vision, gone when you looked directly at them. Or worse, still there, standing impossibly far away yet somehow close enough that you could see they wore no modern clothing, their robes and headwear from an ancient style. Webb trained his cameras on these figures multiple times. The footage shows empty desert, nothing but sand and heat shimmer. Yet, 3 people standing beside him swore they were watching someone standing exactly where the camera pointed. The temperature inside the temple structure ran 15 degrees colder than the surrounding desert. No environmental explanation fit. The stone should have absorbed heat during the day, radiating it at night, maintaining a temperature relatively close to the outside. Instead, it felt like walking into refrigeration. Team members' breath misted in the air. Dr. Rahman placed thermometers throughout the structure, confirming the temperature drop. He could not explain it. On November 18th, one of Hassan's nephews, a young man named Khalid, entered the central temple chamber and found what appeared to be a door in the floor, a stone slab covering a stairway descending deeper into the earth. He called for Dr. Chen. She arrived with Webb, filming. The footage exists. It shows them clearing sand from around the door, revealing more inscriptions. These were different from the others, harsher, more urgent. Chen translated them aloud for the camera. "Here lies the threshold," she read. "Here the bargain was sealed. Let no one break the seal lest the sleepers wake." Chen decided they should open it. This was the discovery she had come for. The proof that Ubar was real, that the legends contained truth. Khalid refused to help. He left the excavation site immediately, walking back to where Hassan waited. He has not spoken publicly about what he saw in that chamber, but he has not returned to the empty quarter since. 4 team members remained in camp, while Chen and 5 others descended those stairs. Webb's camera went with them. The footage from below is fragmentary. The file is corrupted, filled with visual distortions and audio dropout. What remains shows a passageway carved from bedrock, walls covered in more inscriptions and images that the camera renders as blurred shapes. The audio picks up the team's voices, excited, making observations about the architecture. Then Chen's voice changes. She tells everyone to be quiet. In the silence, the microphone captures something else, a sound like breathing. Rhythmic, patient, coming from somewhere deeper in the darkness ahead. The footage cuts to black. When it resumes, the camera is moving rapidly, shaking, pointing at nothing useful. Webb is running. Behind him, someone is screaming. The audio is chaos. Then the recording ends. The team emerged from the temple after dark. All 5 returned, but changed. They packed their equipment in frantic silence, barely speaking, avoiding eye contact with each other and with those who had remained above. Chen ordered immediate evacuation. They would leave everything except essentials, she said. They were departing at first light. That night, the final transmission came through. The satellite phone, activated in desperation, catching Chen's voice reporting that something was in the camp. The recording exists in military and university archives. Various agencies analyzed it, searching for explanation. The background contains sounds that acoustic experts cannot identify. Not animal, not wind, not machinery, something else. At dawn, Hassan led them out of the empty quarter. They drove without stopping, pushing their vehicles to the limit, not looking back, until they reached the highway 3 days later. None of them have returned. Dr. Sarah Chen resigned from the University of Dubai. She works now in Cairo, studying Roman Egypt, a period and place far removed from the empty quarter. She has declined every interview request, every offer to discuss what the expedition found. Only once did she break her silence, in an email to a colleague. "Some knowledge carries a price we should not pay," she wrote. "Some doors should remain closed." Marcus Webb's hard drives contained hundreds of hours of footage. Much of it is mundane, daily documentation of archaeological work, but scattered throughout are the anomalies. The spinning compasses, the figures that appear to some but not to cameras. And in the corrupted footage from below the temple, if you enhance the audio and filter out the distortion, you can hear what might be voices. Many voices, speaking in unison. Words in a language that predates Arabic, predates the written record. Linguists who have attempted translation describe the words as a summoning, an invitation, a promise of power to those who break the seal. Satellite imagery from December 2017 shows the excavation site completely buried. Sand has reclaimed the ruins as thoroughly as if the expedition never occurred. Meteorological records show no storms in that region during the relevant period. No wind strong enough to move that volume of sand. The site simply disappeared beneath the dunes, erased as though by deliberate intent. The Bedouin guides have spoken more freely than the archaeologists. Hassan gave one interview to a regional newspaper. He said what he has always said, that the empty quarter holds secrets older than human memory. That the city called Ubar fell, not because of divine punishment for Djinn worship, but because its people made bargains with things that should never be summoned. That the destruction was not punishment, but containment. A prison built of sand and silence. And that some prisons are meant to be eternal. Dr. Chen keeps one artifact from the expedition. A small clay tablet overlooked in the hasty evacuation. The inscription is simple, translated into English only once, for her own records. "We opened the gate in our arrogance," it reads. The sleepers answered, "May Allah bury our sins so deep that none who follow make the same mistake." The empty quarter keeps its secrets still. The dunes shift and settle, covering and revealing according to patterns beyond human understanding. And somewhere beneath those sands, in darkness that has lasted millennia, something waits with the patience of stone and the hunger of forgotten gods. The desert night in Kuwait transforms industrial sites into landscapes of alien geometry, where flare stacks cast dancing shadows across sand dunes and the mechanical hum of extraction equipment provides a constant backdrop to the silence. Workers on the night shift at petroleum facilities throughout the Gulf states have long shared stories among themselves, tales they keep from management, accounts that never make it into official incident reports. But in the autumn of 2018, something happened at a Kuwait oil company facility that would shatter the informal code of silence that had persisted for decades among those who work in the industry's most remote locations. The Ahmadi facility, located south of Kuwait City, had been in operation since the 1940s, but new exploration in 2017 had identified promising reserves beneath an area that previous surveys had somehow overlooked. The drilling team broke ground in early 2018, working through layers of sedimentary rock that told the geological story of the region's ancient past. What they didn't know, what couldn't have appeared on any modern survey, was that they were drilling directly through the remains of a settlement that predated the earliest historical records of the region. According to the archaeological consultant brought in weeks after the incident, the site may have been occupied as far back as 3,000 years ago, during a period when the climate was different and permanent settlements existed in areas now consumed by desert. The first signs that something was wrong came not from the drill site itself, but from the refinery complex approximately half a mile away. Night shift supervisor Khalid al-Mutari, a 20-year veteran of Kuwait Oil Company operations, noticed it first during his rounds on September 14, 2018. The temperature sensors in Processing Unit 7 began registering anomalous readings, spiking to levels that should have indicated fire or equipment failure, yet visual inspection revealed nothing wrong. Al-Mutari ordered a temporary shutdown of the unit, assuming a sensor malfunction, but within minutes, workers in adjacent areas began reporting an oppressive heat that seemed to move through the facility like something alive. Mohammed Hassan, a pipeline technician working that shift, describes the moment he first saw it. He was conducting a pressure check near the catalytic cracking unit when the temperature around him suddenly surged. Hassan says he felt the heat before he saw anything, a wave of scorching air that made breathing difficult and caused the exposed skin on his arms to redden instantly. When he turned toward the source, he witnessed something that contradicted everything he understood about the physical world. Moving between the metal structures of the processing equipment was a form, distinctly human in shape, but impossibly tall, perhaps 9 or 10 feet in height. It radiated visible heat waves, the kind you see rising from sun-baked asphalt, but intensified to an extreme degree. Most disturbing were what Hassan describes as its eyes, 2 points of light that burned with the intensity of welding torches, leaving afterimages in his vision when he tried to look away. Hassan wasn't alone in seeing it. 4 other workers on duty that night provided consistent descriptions of the entity, each account matching the others in key details, despite the witnesses being separated across different areas of the facility. Ahmed al-Sabah, working in the control room, spotted it on the external cameras, a heat shimmer moving with purpose through areas where no personnel should have been present. Yusuf Ibrahim, conducting safety checks near the storage tanks, came within 20 feet of the entity and describes feeling the air itself become almost solid with heat, creating pressure against his chest that made it difficult to breathe. The facility's thermal imaging system, upgraded just 6 months earlier for enhanced safety monitoring, captured what official reports would later attempt to explain away. The footage shows a human-shaped heat signature moving through the complex over a period of 47 minutes. The temperature readings associated with this signature exceeded 800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite most organic materials, hot enough to cause severe burns at a distance of several feet. Yet wherever it moved, no fires started, no equipment melted. The entity seemed to exist in violation of thermodynamic principles, radiating impossible heat without transferring that energy in expected ways. Safety protocols demanded evacuation of the affected sections, and Al-Mutari ordered a site-wide alert. Workers gathered at the designated muster points, sharing their accounts, realizing that multiple people had witnessed the same impossible thing. Some of the older workers, men who had spent decades in Gulf petroleum operations, weren't surprised. They spoke of stories passed down from previous generations of workers, tales of entities disturbed by drilling operations, of ancient things that lived in the deep desert places and did not welcome intrusion into their domains. The official investigation began within hours, led by Kuwait Oil Company safety officials who arrived expecting to find evidence of gas leaks, equipment malfunction, or perhaps mass hallucination caused by chemical exposure. What they found instead was footage they couldn't explain, testimony from credible witnesses who had no history of mental health issues or substance abuse, and physical evidence that supported the impossible accounts. Scorch marks appeared on metal surfaces where the entity had passed, marks that showed no chemical residue or accelerant, no explanation for their presence. The thermal imaging footage remained unexplained, with company technicians unable to identify any equipment malfunction or environmental condition that could have produced such readings. The archaeological discovery came almost by accident. Dr. Fatima Al-Rashid, a consultant reviewing environmental impact assessments for the drilling operation, noticed fragments of pottery and worked stone in core samples from the new drill site. Pushing for a more thorough investigation despite company resistance, she uncovered evidence of significant archaeological remains directly beneath the drilling location. The settlement appeared to be from the pre-Islamic period, a substantial community that had somehow been lost to historical record. Among the artifacts recovered were unusual clay vessels sealed with bitumen, some still intact after millennia underground. Ancient texts from the region speak of Djinn being bound or contained by wise men, sealed away in vessels, or imprisoned in underground chambers with powerful incantations and physical barriers. The implication was clear to those willing to consider it. The drilling operation had breached something that had been deliberately sealed, releasing or disturbing an entity that local folklore had long warned about. Ifrit, according to Islamic tradition and pre-Islamic Arabian mythology, are powerful beings of fire, intelligent and capable of great destruction when angered. They are not demons in the Western sense, but creatures of smokeless fire, created before humanity and possessing their own agency and will. The descriptions provided by witnesses matched traditional accounts of Ifrit with unsettling precision. The impossible height, the radiating heat, the eyes like burning coals. Kuwait Oil Company's response followed a predictable pattern. The thermal imaging footage was classified as proprietary technical data and removed from general access. Witnesses were required to sign expanded non-disclosure agreements as a condition of continued employment. The official incident report attributed the event to a combination of equipment malfunction and heat stress affecting multiple workers, a conclusion that satisfied regulatory requirements while explaining nothing. Dr. Al-Rashid's archaeological findings were acknowledged but minimized, with the company funding a brief survey that recovered artifacts before drilling resumed. No one in authority wanted to address the possibility that something beyond conventional explanation had occurred. But the workers knew. They had seen it, felt the scorching heat, looked into those burning eyes. Word spread through the informal networks that connect petroleum workers across the Gulf states. Text messages, phone calls during off hours, conversations in the cafeterias and break rooms where management doesn't listen. Similar accounts began to surface from facilities in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Oman. Not all had the dramatic evidence of the Ahmadi incident, but the pattern was consistent. Drilling operations, particularly those penetrating ancient geological layers or disturbing previously untouched areas, seemed to be encountering something that defied conventional understanding. In response, workers developed their own protocols passed along outside official channels. Protective rituals before shifts became common, small ceremonies that blended Islamic prayer with older traditions. Some workers carry verses from the Quran, specifically those believed to offer protection against Djinn. Others use salt and iron, ancient protections found in folklore across many cultures. These practices exist in the shadow of official operations, never acknowledged in safety meetings or operational procedures, but widely observed nonetheless among those who worked the night shifts in the most remote facilities. Mahmoud Aziz, a drilling supervisor with 30 years of experience across multiple Gulf state operations, speaks carefully when discussing these matters. He acknowledges that things happen in the deep desert, at the interface between human industry and ancient Earth, that don't fit neatly into incident reports. He describes a culture of silence around such events, not because workers fear ridicule, but because experience has shown that reporting unusual occurrences leads nowhere productive. Companies want explanations that fit within established framework. They want problems that can be solved with engineering solutions and safety protocols. An entity of fire that exists outside the laws of physics isn't something that can be addressed in a board meeting or resolved with updated procedures. The entity from the Ahmadi facility was seen again in late 2019, this time at a Saudi Aramco operation near the border region. The description matched perfectly: impossibly tall, radiating heat, eyes like burning coals. Then in early 2020, reports came from a facility in the United Arab Emirates, followed by accounts from Oman later that same year. Whether these represent the same entity or multiple beings disturbed by the expansion of drilling operations remains unclear. What is clear is that something has changed in the relationship between the petroleum industry and the ancient places it invades in search of resources. Workers speak of patterns they've noticed. The entities appear most frequently at operations that have drilled through archaeological remains or penetrated particularly ancient geological formations. They manifest during night shifts, in the hours between midnight and dawn, when facilities run on skeleton crews. They seem drawn to areas of intense heat or flame, appearing near flare stacks and processing units where hydrocarbons burn continuously. Some workers believe the entities are territorial, protecting places that humans never should have disturbed. Others think they were imprisoned long ago and are now being inadvertently released by drilling operations that breach their ancient prisons. The petroleum companies maintain their official silence, neither confirming nor denying the accounts that circulate among their workforce. Insurance adjusters have quietly noted unusual patterns in incident reports from Gulf state facilities, clusters of heat-related injuries and equipment failures that don't match expected statistical distribution. Thermal imaging equipment continues to occasionally capture anomalous readings that technicians struggle to explain. And workers continue to perform their protective rituals, acknowledging through action what official policy refuses to address. As drilling operations push deeper and into previously untouched areas, driven by the industry's endless hunger for new reserves, encounters with the unexplained may become more frequent rather than less. The earth beneath the desert holds more than petroleum and natural gas. It holds history, archaeology, and according to those who work in the darkness of the night shift, it holds entities of fire that remember when these lands belonged to them alone. The Ifrit of the Gulf petroleum fields remain, moving through the industrial landscape like living flames, reminders that some boundaries perhaps were never meant to be crossed, and some ancient seals were placed for reasons that remain valid across millennia. The cameras began rolling on the morning of March 7, 2020, in a small village nestled in the foothills of Morocco's Middle Atlas Mountains. What would unfold over the next 73 days would become the most meticulously documented case of suspected possession in modern history, captured by multiple recording devices, witnessed by medical professionals, and analyzed by linguistic experts who would later struggle to explain what they had seen. Latifa was 14 years old when the changes began. Her family describes her as a quiet girl, devoted to her studies, helping her mother with the household duties each afternoon after school. She spoke only the Daraya dialect, common to her region, along with some French learned in the classroom. She had never traveled beyond the neighboring province, had never studied classical Arabic beyond basic Quranic recitation that any child in her community might know. By all accounts, she was ordinary in every way that mattered. The first signs appeared as subtle shifts in temperament. Latifa became withdrawn, spending hours staring at the bare walls of her room. Her mother noticed she had stopped eating meals with the family, claiming the food tasted like ash in her mouth. At night, her younger siblings reported hearing her voice through the thin walls, speaking in animated conversation though she was alone. When her father questioned her, Latifa insisted she remembered none of it. Within a week, the episodes intensified. Latifa would fall into states that her family initially mistook for seizures. Her body would go rigid, her eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. But unlike seizures, she remained conscious throughout, and when she spoke, the voice that emerged was not her own. It was deeper, resonant with an authority that seemed impossible from such a slight frame. The words were classical Arabic, the formal language of ancient texts, pronounced with the precision of a scholar who had spent decades mastering its complex grammar and vocabulary. Her parents brought her to a doctor in the nearest town, a physician who had practiced for 30 years and had seen his share of unexplained conditions. He found nothing wrong. Her blood work showed normal values. Brain scans revealed no abnormalities, no tumors or lesions that might explain the dramatic personality shifts. The doctor suggested psychological evaluation, but even as he made the recommendation, something in the clinical examination room had unsettled him. He would later tell investigators that when Latifa looked at him during one of her episodes, he felt she was seeing directly through him, accessing memories he had never shared with anyone. The family made the decision to document everything. They positioned cameras in Latifa's room, in the common areas of their home, recording continuously. They invited their local imam, a respected religious authority, who had performed Ruqyah Islamic spiritual healing, for members of their community. They called upon Latifa's extended family, aunts and uncles and grandparents who might offer support or witness what was happening to this girl, who seemed to be slipping away from them. What the cameras captured over those 73 days would fill dozens of hours of footage, but certain moments stand out with particular clarity, instances that defy conventional explanation and continue to provoke debate among those who have reviewed the evidence. On day 12, Latifa's voice changed mid-sentence while speaking with her mother. The shift was instantaneous, from her normal adolescent tone to something harsh and masculine. The entity speaking through her identified itself as a Djinn who had inhabited the land where the family's home now stood for 3 centuries. It spoke in an Arabic dialect that linguistic experts would later identify as consistent with 18th century Moroccan usage, filled with archaic terms and grammatical structures that have long fallen out of common speech. When questioned by the imam present, this entity proceeded to describe in precise detail the location of a well on the family's property that had been filled in and covered over 6 decades earlier, before Latifa's parents were even born. The family excavated the spot. The well was exactly where the entity had indicated, something that none of the current generation had known about. By day 23, multiple distinct entities had emerged, each claiming to inhabit Latifa's body simultaneously. The footage shows her shifting between different voices and personas within the span of minutes. One spoke in the voice of an elderly woman, claiming to be the spirit of a healer who had died in the village a century prior. This entity knew the names of families who had lived in the region generations ago, recounting stories and disputes that could only be verified by consulting elderly residents and old written records held by the village council. Another entity presented itself as a child, speaking in a lisping, frightened voice, claiming to have died in a fire. Yet another was hostile and violent, requiring multiple adult family members to restrain Latifa's small frame as strength that seemed physically impossible poured through her limbs. Medical professionals who examined Latifa during her possessed states documented physiological changes that appeared to contradict known biological patterns. Her heart rate would spike to levels that should have caused cardiac arrest, sustained for minutes at a time, then return to normal the instant she emerged from the episode. Her body temperature fluctuated wildly, dropping to hypothermic levels and then surging to fever pitch within the span of an hour, with no apparent medical cause. Her pupils would dilate fully even in bright light, or contract to pinpoints in darkness, moving independently of environmental stimuli. The moment that would become the most analyzed segment of footage occurred on day 41. During an attempted exorcism session, with the imam reciting Quranic verses and family members gathered in prayer, Latifa began speaking in classical Arabic with a formality and eloquence that stunned everyone present. The entity speaking through her claimed to have knowledge of what lay hidden beneath the earth, in a location approximately 70 kilometers from the village. It described in specific terms an underground chamber containing pottery and tools from an ancient settlement. The entity provided geographic coordinates, described the depth at which these items would be found, even detailed the specific types of artifacts that excavation would reveal. The imam recorded these claims carefully, noting the date and time. It would be 3 months before the National Archaeological Service would announce the discovery of a previously unknown Neolithic site at those exact coordinates. The public announcement came in late June of 2020, describing findings that matched the entity's description with unnerving accuracy. Pottery shards, grinding stones, the remains of what appeared to be a small settlement dating back thousands of years. The archaeologists had been working quietly on the excavation for weeks before making their findings public, and there was no possible way that information could have reached a remote village or a 14-year-old girl who had never left her rural community. Skeptics have suggested numerous explanations. Perhaps Latifa had overheard conversations. Perhaps there had been rumors among archaeological circles that somehow filtered down. But investigators who have reviewed the case note the specificity of the information provided, details about artifact placement and soil composition that would only become clear after extensive excavation, information that even the archaeological team itself did not possess on the day Latifa spoke those words. The exorcism sessions intensified through May, and into early June. The footage from these sessions is difficult to watch. Latifa's body contorts in ways that appear to exceed normal human flexibility, her spine arching backward until her head nearly touches her heels. Her voice drops to registers that sound physically impossible from her throat. At times, multiple voices seem to speak simultaneously, creating a layered, discordant sound that the audio equipment struggles to capture clearly. During one particularly intense session on day 58, Latifa revealed family secrets that had been carefully hidden for generations. She spoke of her grandfather's brother, who had died under suspicious circumstances 40 years earlier, describing the true cause of his death in detail that made her grandmother weep with recognition. She knew about a stillborn child that her mother had lost before Latifa was born, a grief that had never been discussed with the children. She described conflicts and betrayals within the extended family that had occurred before she was born, information that, when verified with elder family members, proved accurate in ways that could not be explained by lucky guessing or overhearing whispers. Medical doctors brought in to observe these sessions found themselves unable to provide conventional diagnoses. One neurologist who examined Latifa during an episode noted that her brain activity patterns showed unusual coherence across different regions, a synchronization that he had never observed in decades of practice. Blood samples taken during possession states showed elevated levels of stress hormones, but also anomalies in her biochemistry that returned to normal ranges within minutes of the episode ending. By day 73, the exorcisms had achieved partial success. The most violent and hostile entities seemed to have departed, their voices no longer emerging from Latifa's throat. The sessions ended with prayers and protective rituals, with the imam declaring that the worst had passed, but warning that complete liberation might never be possible. Some presences, he suggested, leave marks that do not fully fade. Today, 4 years after those 73 days of documented torment, Latifa lives with her family in the same village. She has returned to school, though she studies now with an awareness that sets her apart from her peers. The episodes still come, though less frequently and with less intensity. She describes them as moments when her own consciousness seems to recede, making space for something else, some other awareness that looks out through her eyes and knows things she should not know. Most disturbing to those who know her is the ability she has retained, an unwanted gift from those months of possession. Latifa can sense Djinn presence in others. She knows when these entities have attached themselves to people she encounters, can feel their influence like a cold pressure against her awareness. This sensitivity has made her both a resource and an outsider in her community. People seek her insight, but they also fear what she represents, proof that the barrier between the visible and invisible worlds is thinner than most wish to believe. The 73 days of footage remain the most comprehensive documentation of suspected possession ever compiled. The multiple cameras, the medical supervision, the linguistic analysis, all converge to create a case that resists simple dismissal. Whether one believes in Djinn, in spiritual possession, or seeks psychological and neurological explanations, the evidence demands engagement. Something happened to Latifa in those months, something that multiple witnesses observed, that cameras recorded, that left physical and psychological marks still visible years later. We began this journey with questions that seem simple enough on the surface. Do Djinn exist? Are they merely fragments of ancient superstition, convenient explanations for phenomena our ancestors couldn't understand? But now, having examined the evidence, having listened to the testimonies, having confronted the inexplicable patterns that emerge across continents and centuries, we find ourselves facing something far more unsettling than simple answers. Consider the consistency. A farmer in rural Indonesia describes a creature of smokeless fire that appears at dusk, capable of assuming human form, but betraying itself through inverted feet. Thousands of miles away, in a Moroccan village where no internet reaches, an elderly woman recounts identical details passed down through 5 generations. In the Amazon, isolated tribes speak of spirits matching the same description. These cultures developed in complete isolation from one another, separated by oceans and millennia, yet their accounts align with disturbing precision. The same attributes, the same behaviors, the same warnings. Skeptics suggest universal human psychology, arguing that our brains are wired to create similar myths. But this explanation falters when confronted with the specificity of the details. It's not just that cultures worldwide speak of spirits. It's that they describe the same taxonomy, the same hierarchy, the same rules of engagement. The Ifrit, the Marid, the Ghoul. These aren't vague ghost stories. They're detailed classifications that remain constant from North Africa to Southeast Asia, from medieval manuscripts to contemporary testimonies. Then there's the physical evidence that refuses to disappear under scientific scrutiny. The burns that appear on witnesses' skin in patterns that thermal analysis confirms couldn't come from conventional sources. The recordings that capture voices speaking in frequencies beyond normal human range. The electromagnetic disturbances that spike during reported encounters, documented by instruments that don't lie or embellish. The thermal imaging that reveals heat signatures in empty rooms, signatures that move with apparent intelligence and purpose. Science does what science does best. It measures, documents, and confirms that something is happening. But it stops short of explanation, unable to fit these phenomena into existing frameworks. The evidence exists in that uncomfortable space between empirical verification and theoretical impossibility. We can prove something occurred. We cannot explain what that something is. Islamic eschatology offers a theory that most modern minds reject instinctively, yet one that accounts for every anomaly we've encountered. What if jinn are not metaphor or myth? What if they represent a genuine parallel intelligence, beings created before humanity from smokeless fire, inhabiting dimensions that intersect with our own? According to this framework, they've never left. They've always been here, living in civilizations as complex as ours, pursuing their own agendas, watching us with the same detached curiosity we might observe an ant colony. The Quran speaks of them as created beings with free will, capable of good and evil, organized into communities with their own prophets and laws. This isn't primitive superstition. It's a sophisticated cosmological model, suggesting that reality contains more layers than our senses perceive. That consciousness exists in forms we're only beginning to detect. That we share this world with intelligences older and stranger than we've imagined. What makes this theory particularly disturbing is how well it fits the data. It explains the consistency of accounts across cultures. It explains why encounters follow patterns suggesting intelligence rather than random supernatural events. It explains the physical evidence that points to something real, but not material in the way we understand matter. Most unsettling of all, it explains why these encounters are increasing. Global reports of jinn encounters have risen exponentially in recent decades. From isolated incidents in remote villages, we've moved to frequent sightings in urban centers, documented by multiple witnesses using modern technology. The Middle East reports thousands of cases annually. Southeast Asian governments maintain official databases of supernatural incidents. Even Western countries, where such beliefs are culturally discouraged, see growing numbers of unexplained encounters matching traditional jinn descriptions. Some researchers suggest we're experiencing an unveiling. Our technology has finally reached a threshold where we can detect what was always present. Electromagnetic sensors, thermal imaging, audio equipment capable of capturing infrasound and ultrasound. We've built tools that can perceive beyond human limitations, and those tools are revealing entities that exist just outside our sensory range. The jinn haven't changed. Our ability to document them has. But there's another possibility that Islamic tradition has always maintained. That we're approaching an end time when the barriers between worlds grow thin. That increased encounters signal not our technological advancement but a cosmic shift, a drawing closer of dimensions that were once more separate. That the jinn are making themselves known because the age of humanity's dominance is waning. Islamic eschatology contains a prophecy that should disturb us more than any individual encounter. It states that jinn will outlive humanity, that long after our civilizations crumble, after our technologies rust into dust, after the last human draws their final breath, the jinn will remain. They existed before us. They'll exist after us. We are the temporary inhabitants of a world they've always called home. From their perspective, we're the visitors, the brief anomaly in their eternal watch. Imagine that vantage point. Beings who measure time in epochs rather than lifetimes, who've witnessed the rise and fall of countless species, who view human history as we might view the lifespan of a moth. To them, we're already fading. Our entire civilization, from its first spark to its inevitable extinction, is just one more chapter in a story they've seen play out repeatedly across millions of years. This is the ultimate cosmic horror. Not that monsters exist, but that we exist as footnotes in someone else's story. That our greatest achievements, our wars and loves and dreams, are witnessed with the mild interest of beings who've seen it all before and will see it all again after we're gone. That we live our lives under observation, by intelligences we cannot fully perceive. Intelligences to whom we matter less than we'd like to believe. The evidence doesn't allow us comfortable skepticism anymore. Too many witnesses. Too much physical documentation. Too many patterns that suggest genuine phenomena rather than mass delusion. But accepting the reality of Djinn means accepting our place in a cosmos far stranger and more crowded than modern materialism allows. It means acknowledging that the shadows at the edge of vision might contain something looking back. That the ancient warnings weren't primitive superstition but accurate threat assessment, passed down by those who learned through terrible experience. Every culture that encountered Djinn developed rules for coexistence. Don't disturb certain places at certain times. Don't venture alone into liminal spaces. Respect the boundaries between worlds. These aren't random superstitions. They're survival strategies, hard-won wisdom about sharing reality with something older and other. We've forgotten these rules in our electric-lit modernity. Perhaps that's why encounters are increasing. We've stopped being careful. So we return to our original question, transformed by everything we've examined. The question isn't whether they exist. The evidence, uncomfortable as it is, points towards something real. The question isn't even whether we should be afraid, though fear is perhaps the appropriate response. The real question, the one that should keep us awake in the dark, is whether they've ever stopped watching. Whether in this moment, as you listen to these words, you're as alone as you think you are. Whether the empty room is truly empty. Whether the Djinn who've witnessed humanity's entire arc are observing right now, patient and eternal, waiting for our chapter to close as they've waited through countless chapters before. Waiting for the day when they'll still be here, and will be nothing but another legend they tell their young about the strange species that briefly thought itself alone in the universe. They're watching. They've always been watching. And long after we're gone, they'll still be there, waiting for whatever comes next. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.